And thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the recent findings of your 2025 top risk report. And we know that forecasting is not an easy task, but you've been successfully doing that for the last 20 years. And some of the predictions seem to be materializing already. And I wanted to start with the Mexico-U.S. developments. Just recently, you mentioned that Mexican leadership would need to cooperate with the new U.S. administration rather than oppose it. And we saw that the Mexican president, after the call with Donald Trump, actually pledged to send more troops to the border in exchange for a temporary tariff break. And I was wondering if you feel that this dynamic is going to become permanent in a sense that the choice will already be made in favor of a bad peace instead of a good war, or maybe good peace is possible in this case.
A bad peace between the U.S. and Mexico? Well, I mean, if you're the Mexican government, I mean, if we're starting with Mexico, let's recognize that of all of the countries in the world, this is the one whose supply chain is most integrated with the United States. They have no choices. It's like asking about China and Laos and saying, Laos, you want to develop something with Japan or with Canada instead? I mean, no, of course. And so you have, USMCA. You have, enormous amounts of remittances from Mexicans in the U.S. going into the Mexican economy. And you're attached to the most successful, largest economy in the world. So, you are oriented not to screw that up. And also, you have a president who has won effectively a constitutional majority in her own Congress. So in other words, she doesn't have political limitations from domestic cleavages or factions that stop her from engaging constructively with Trump. So she can give Trump a lot of what he wants if she wishes to. And I've had a lot of back and forth with the Sheinbaum government, with her core cabinet officials. They're actually quite technocratic. They're competent. They're capable. And they've been very careful, I think, to try to find a way to work with the Americans that doesn't blow up in their faces and also aligns with their own interests. I mean, the fact of the matter is that all of this Chinese investment into Mexico and through Mexico into the United States hasn't been as exciting for Mexico as they would have liked. So you look at all of the cars that are being produced, Chinese electric vehicles, they're being assembled in Mexico, but the actual manufacturer is back in China. There aren't many high quality jobs in Mexico. There's a lot of relatively cheap textiles from China and other low-grade manufacturers that are in Mexico now, but that's taking a lot of jobs away from small and medium enterprises in Mexico that are very important to Sheinbaum's base, the Morena Party base. So she's oriented to help on that. They haven't done much on enforcement on fentanyl, but it's not like they're super happy about all the fentanyl being produced and the gangs illegally benefiting from that. So, I mean, an excuse for her to use the police more effectively in breaking down that trade is something that ultimately helps her. So I think that this is, look, it's tough on Mexico and it's hurting their economy, of course, and the uncertainty is stressful for them. It's not the ideal way to treat a trusted ally or a friend. Trump is more than willing to show that he's going to punch his friends in the teeth if they don't give him what he wants. And that's not long-term. I think that damages American credibility, American soft power, and the durability of U.S. alliances. That's a broader question. But I don't think it damages it much with Mexico. Again, since you're starting with the country that really needs the U.S. so much, is so integrated with the U.S., I think that it will ultimately get done. It's going to take longer than the markets expected at a time that the Mexican peso is not doing very well, that the economy has suffered in part because of all the constitutional reforms, including judicial reform, that a lot of investors, including from the US, really aren't comfortable with. So there are challenges. But I feel quite comfortable that the Mexicans and the Americans will eventually figure this all out and figure it out in a pretty constructive way.
And you noted that it will be challenging for the current Mexican president to establish a strong personal relationship with Donald Trump. And I just wanted to ask you a broader question. How much of a role personal relationships on the high level are going to play now in terms of amending the world order?
Well, they matter, but they're not, sort of definitive. So the reality is Trump has been able to cut deals with people that he doesn't particularly like. I mean, he hates Justin Trudeau. He thinks he's a weakling and a weenie. And yet, the Canadians got the same 1-month suspension on their trade deal, even with an election coming up, and the potential that a much more favorably inclined conservative government would come in on the back of that, didn't stop Trump from giving him that deal. You're going to have tomorrow, Prime Minister Ishiba is going to be meeting with Trump, and he was desperate to get that meeting. I think too desperate. I think that showed weakness. I think it's better to stay out of the headlines a little bit when you're dealing with Trump, but that's always been the way with the Japanese. They want to symbolically show that they're a very important relationship. And you'll remember that Shinzo Abe came to Trump Tower and brought him the Golden Golf Club and the whole thing. Ishiba's not Abe. He won't have the personal relationship with Trump that Abe did, and it does matter. But I don't think that necessarily undermines the ability of Japan to get something done with the U.S. What I do think is that Sheinbaum, and again, since you brought her up, I mean, she is a woman. She is a PhD. She's a scientist with environmental science as her background, and she went to Berkeley. So, I mean, pretty much, I guess if she were black and a lesbian, that would also be even more problematic. But leaving that aside, it's hard to come up with a demographic that would be more antagonistic towards the kind of stuff that Trump likes, right? I mean, she's not a Fox News anchor, right? And that's what he gravitates towards. That's how he makes a lot of his cabinet appointments. So she knows that. She understands that's not going to be an easy relationship. And that comes off of her predecessor and in some ways mentor, President Lopez Obrador, who I know quite well. And I mean, he's about Trump's age. And although he's far left as opposed to far right, he's equally fancies himself a man of the people, a populist, a historic figure. They got along very well personally. So she knows that. And I think that has helped to inform her strategy, which is I'm not going to have a big meeting one-on-one. I'm going to do a phone call and I'm going to appoint someone to kind of work this relationship who knows these guys really well. And we're going to be more careful and cautious. And I'm also not going to overreact intemperately to an announcement that Trump makes, which is always a bad thing to do, right? I mean, it's much better to be calm. By the way, Xi Jinping, his reactions to Trump in the early days, in my view, very different country, very different situation, but his personal reactions have been somewhat similar to President Sheinbaum's reactions, and I think that's interesting.
I hope we will come back to China in a little bit, but I just wanted to dovetail on what you were saying about personal relationships. And I'm wondering if you think that Trump and Putin have a potential for a positive personal relationship that could shape a peace deal for Ukraine.
Not as much as you would think. First of all, I should mention that I think that Zelensky has done yeoman's work at kissing Trump's ass over the last several months. And he's been effective. He's really talked about, how much he wants to be able to work with Trump, that Trump is the guy that can potentially bring peace. He's been very proactive. He's been suitably deferential in a way that I personally couldn't, but I mean, I'm not in politics, right? And so, I mean, that's a personal choice. And I think that it frankly shows a leadership skill that Zelensky has that he's capable and willing of doing that effectively for his country, which is in a very weak position right now. And remember, this is the guy that Trump said is a great salesman, can sell everything. I don't know why we're spending all that money. And now Trump is talking about, well, maybe I'll give you more military support if you allow us to exploit critical minerals. And the German chancellor came out and said, that's such a horrible thing. It's so selfish. Zelensky didn't do that. Zelensky said, oh, that's a very interesting idea, sir. We should talk about that, sir. Absolutely. What a great idea. You know, and if I were the German chancellor, I would have sucked it up and kept my mouth shut. You know, I mean, he doesn't need to score a point on that, but he's very angry at Trump because Elon has been coming after him and supporting the Alternatives for Deutschland. And so I think, you know, as he's leaving power, he feels more insecure, he feels angrier, and frankly is doing less of a capable job running his country than Zelensky, in my view, is representing his own national interests. So now Putin is a different story. And, you know, everyone that hates Trump likes to say that Trump is in Putin's pocket. We have no evidence of that. In fact, we have a lot of evidence to the contrary. What we've seen in Trump's first term is that it was the Trump administration that increased sanctions on Russia. And it was the Trump administration that provided the missile systems, the anti-tank javelins that Obama refused to provide because he thought it was too dangerous, too risky, and would antagonize Putin. Now, what I know is that the fact that Putin is a dictator does not in any way antagonize Trump. He has no problem speaking with dictators, even unfriendly dictators like Kim Jong-un, in a way that Biden or Obama would find it distasteful, would find it somehow antithetical to American interests. Trump does not feel that way. And so I think Trump is certainly willing to provide in that regard a level of symbolic respect to Putin that he doesn't feel like he gets from other leaders. But Trump also understands that he has a lot more leverage with Ukraine and Zelensky to get to a ceasefire, if not a negotiated settlement, and that he doesn't have that leverage with Putin. And he's going to need to use sticks as well as carrots to induce Putin, and he might need help, including from the Chinese, which Trump has now brought up both publicly as well as privately directly with Xi Jinping, on a number of occasions. And, you know, I got to tell you, if you're Putin and you see Trump as the guy who is pushing the Europeans very hard, not accepting 2% of GDP defense spend, but instead 3, 4, 5, like, that's not what Putin wants. That's the opposite of what Putin wants, right? Putin wants a weak NATO. He doesn't want the Europeans to spend more. He wants the Europeans divided. And so, I mean, it's great for Putin if Trump divides the Europeans, but if Trump convinces the Europeans that they need to do a lot more for defense collectively and for Ukraine, which thus far seems to be the case, that's the direction of travel, I'm not sure that's good for Putin at all.
Ian, in your report, Russia ranks number 5. It's actually less than it was, in a sense, downgraded from.
That's right, from last year. Yeah.
How do you explain that downgrade? What changed?
Well, let's keep in mind what is the ordering of the risks. Number 1, likelihood. Number 2, imminence. Number 3, impact. And it's in the context of what we are expecting for the coming 12 months, only 12 months. And from 2024 to 2025, the global risk environment has gotten a lot worse. So in other words, it's not enough to stand still as a risk to maintain your ranking. You've got to up your game. And I'm afraid that the Russians and Ukrainians haven't upped their risk game. Why? Well, number 1, because it is more likely that fighting is going to become a ceasefire. That's number 1. And there's a lot of pressure from the Americans and the Europeans increasingly for that to be the case. Now, the fact that the fighting may not be as active over Ukraine in 6 months' time as it has been over the last year. And I would say there's some uncertainty around that because, of course, there's going to be an effort by the Russians and Ukrainians to both improve their position before they start negotiations. And that could increase the risk factor for a short period of time as a consequence. But it doesn't fix the relationship, and it's still highly plausible the Russians will be engaged in asymmetric proxy warfare. When you talk about countries like Romania and the Baltics, Poland, the Nordics, they've certainly been willing to spend a lot of money to pay for vandalism and arson and even assassination attacks. They've been willing to engage in strikes against critical infrastructure, including the severing of fiber cables. So, I mean, I don't think that anyone should be sleeping on the risk that's coming from Russia specifically, but it's much less about Ukraine. And remember, the risk from last year was about a partitioned Ukraine, which we are clearly heading towards. I'm not happy about that, but that is the reality. This year's risk is much more about Russia, and it's much less about Ukraine itself.
You're predicting that Ukraine is going to feature less in the headlines this year.
That's pretty clear. I mean, if you just look at people randomly calling me all over the world in the last several months, I mean, of course, Gaza took up a lot more attention, and then Lebanon and Iran. The U.S. has taken up an extraordinary amount of attention, and also the U.S.-China relationship, plus China's economic challenges. I would say that Russia-Ukraine, which was really top of mind for the first 18 months of that war, is not close to that right now. And that's also true in terms of how much time, the most important policymakers are spending on it. Now, in Europe, of course, given their geographic proximity, that's less true. But, if I think about my regular conversations with the Biden administration and now with folks in the Trump team that have come in, at the beginning of the war, Russia-Ukraine was just utterly dominant factor, right? And that significantly diminished. And the amount of headspace that's being devoted to this issue also means not just how much resource you're spending, but the political capital, the willingness to engage with allies and adversaries to move them in a difficult direction on an issue that requires a lot of deft diplomacy and coercion and deterrence. And so if you're not spending the time, this is not Sudan levels. It's not Nagorno-Karabakh levels, right? I mean, where they're largely forgotten and nobody really cares what happens. But it's not where it was, Yulia.
Ian, coming back to China that you have already brought up, it's on the list of your risks alongside with Russia, and Moscow and Beijing are self-proclaimed best friends, although you've described them as partners of convenience. Does this partnership present any additional, maybe combined risks?
I think the partnership is becoming somewhat more strategic over time. And I think that is true because Xi Jinping himself has a very good personal relationship with Putin. As you suggested earlier, the personal relationships can matter. The senior advisors around Xi Jinping, who I meet with, with reasonable regularity, are much less comfortable that the tightness of that relationship has been great for China. They think that the war has gone on too long, that Putin has not been credible in what he has told the Chinese he'd be able to get done, that it has undermined China's position, especially with the Europeans, which is not ideal, that if it was up to China, they'd like the war to be over. And of course, it's leading to higher prices in commodities and all the rest. I think that the fact is also the Russians, of course, got that defense partnership with North Korea, and there are 11,000 North Koreans fighting with the Russians against Ukraine. And the Chinese were not a part of that negotiation. They found out about it. And that's not exactly what the Chinese government likes to hear from a country that's caused a fair amount of agita for the Chinese over the past decades, a rogue state that is not always easy to contain or control. And now the Russians have more influence over it, and they are helping them technologically to make them a more powerful rogue going forward. That is clearly not what China would like to see for North Korea. So, I think we should only go so far. I mean, I remember Tony Blinken wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs a few months ago where he talked about an axis of Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. I strongly disagreed with that formulation at the time. And I thought that, they're all problematic actors from America's perspective. But Russia, North Korea, and Iran are chaos actors that are trying to subvert the international order. China is an adversary and a competitor of the U.S., and there's not really any trust between the two countries. But China actually really needs global stability for itself to thrive. It needs a U.S. economy that's doing well. Russia absolutely wants America to fail. China is the principal creditor to the global South. Russia takes advantage of chaos in the global South. That's where they are able to act and have space and political influence. So there really isn't the kind of strategic alignment long term between the Russians and the Chinese that I think would allow for them to become allies. But if Trump continues to make efforts to contain China, no matter what he says to Xi Jinping, and if the Russia war against NATO continues, whether or not we get a ceasefire with Ukraine, then certainly I can imagine an environment where the Russians and the Chinese find that their relationship of convenience structurally becomes more of a real alliance. I can imagine that happening, but I don't think it's inevitable.
Yeah, and I'm very glad you brought the global South question. And just turning back to the first days of Trump in the office, he has focused heavily on Latin America, and under the pressure, Panama has already declared pulling out of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And now
when the membership re-ups, that's right.
In 3 years, yeah. Is Trump, you think, succeeding in breaking the global South alliances?
Panama is a country that is really small and has very little other than the United States to count on. The Chinese Hong Kong companies have a couple of big contracts with their ports, but at the end of the day, that is not worth risking the U.S. relationship for. Most countries in the global South have a stronger economic relationship with China than they do with the United States. And by the way, that includes most of South America. So I think that you're going to have a very different reaction from Panama or from El Salvador or Mexico than you do from Brazil. I mean, South Africa's in the global South, and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, just declined to even travel to the G20 that South Africa's hosting because he's saying that we don't like their woke policies, we don't like their climate policies, where, I mean, in reality, doing that just means that that country is going to be much closer to China. So, I mean, I think that the global South is divided. And that was very clear when the most powerful country in the global South is India, because China, again, is not really in the global South anymore. They're sort of a much more like they're medium income, but they're much more powerful than that. And they're the creditor. They're the ones kind of making the rules for the global South countries increasingly. But India, if they're the most powerful country in the global South, and they're soon going to be the third largest economy in the world by the end of this decade in all likelihood, but they have a closer relationship with the U.S. than they do with China. They really want to act like a bridge. And then you've got other countries like the UAE and the Saudis who have, great relationships with Trump, but they also are selling far more oil to the Chinese. So, I think that you're going to still see an enormous amount of hedging for most of these countries. They don't want a Cold War between the US and China. They don't want a trade war. And even if the US-China relationship heads in that direction, they will do everything in their power to avoid having to make that choice. And I think they will largely succeed in that endeavor.
And this is very interesting, insightful, and I have many more questions, but I'm mindful of our time limitations. And I wanted to ask you the last question. And this is actually about what your 2025 report didn't include. And we know that the doomsday clock recently moved to 89 seconds before midnight. Whatever you make of it, it's closer than ever to the nuclear catastrophe. Yet nuclear confrontation is not mentioned in your report. Do you see this threat as less imminent?
Well, the doomsday clock, I mean, they show it off and they move it 1 second or 10 seconds and they kind of make it up, and it's not clear what the methodology is, and I've never really been comfortable with it. But I mean, I guess it's useful to have a group of respected people that are forcing people to remember that we have these horrible nuclear weapons, and we're not reducing their number. In fact, the arms agreements that we have, we're ripping up between the Americans and the Russians, and the Chinese are developing a lot of nukes, and they don't have any arms control agreements with the Americans. And AI is coming, much faster. And that can be used. I'm very excited about AI for productivity and human capital enhancement. But of course, AI can also be used as a weapon. And I see an AI arms race coming between the US and China with really no limitations from a governance perspective. So, I think the world is becoming much more dangerous. I do. But that doesn't mean to me that we are heading towards World War III. Because first of all, I see the Americans and Chinese in the near term much more inwardly focused, much more focused on their own markets, their own capital, more industrial policy, more inshoring. I see the Americans not wanting to be the global sheriff, not wanting to fight big wars. Trump is the guy that wanted to end Afghanistan. And he's the guy that got the Gaza ceasefire done. And I don't think Harris would have done that if she were president. I don't think she would have been successful at that. So that's interesting. And I don't think China is looking for war anytime soon, even though long-term Taiwan is a question mark. But I do think that we're in a world where impunity is much, much easier to find, where rogue actors, both governments and non-state actors, are becoming much more powerful. I think we're going to see a lot more nuclear proliferation. And I think you're going to see a lot more conflicts that are lower level conflicts. I mean, I think it's more likely in the next 5 years that we see a tactical nuclear weapon going off somewhere than I would have said 5 years ago by a long margin. So, I think the world is becoming more dangerous. Violence is becoming more likely. A G0 world is a world of much greater conflict and much greater deprivation geopolitically. But I don't think we are on the precipice of World War III. And so if I had been behind the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I would have handled this year's announcement a little bit different.
And of course, just for our audiences, G0 world is the world without global leadership, and you also refer to that as the rule of jungle. But it seems like you're keeping optimistic, you're remaining optimistic, even at the backdrop of this being the top risk of your report.
Hey, as long as we're here, what choice do we have? I mean, it's not like we did anything to be born, and it's an extraordinary gift. So optimism should be the human condition.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much, Ian.
For you.